Some children stop speaking when the world becomes too loud. The storm rolled over downtown Chicago like a living thing, swallowing the skyline in sheets of cold rain and distant thunder. Traffic lights blinked yellow through the darkness, while sirens echoed somewhere beyond the flooded streets. Inside a black Escalade stranded beneath the overpass on Interstate 90, 7-year-old Sophie Hale pressed noise-canceling headphones tighter against her ears and stared silently out the rain-covered window. She hadn't spoken in almost 2 hours. Not since the thunder started. Victoria Hale gripped the steering wheel hard enough for her knuckles to pale beneath the glow of the dashboard. Her phone buzzed again. Another call from the board. Another emergency meeting. Another reminder that half the city depended on her company's servers staying online during the storm. She declined the call without looking. Water rushed along the tires now. Too fast. The engine had already died once before coughing back to life. "Come on," she whispered under her breath, pressing the ignition again. Nothing. Just a weak, clicking sound swallowed by thunder overhead. Sophie flinched at the noise and curled deeper into herself beneath the oversized gray hoodie she always wore when she was scared. Victoria looked over quickly. Hey, sweetheart. We're okay." But her voice sounded thinner than she intended. The rain hammered the windshield so hard it blurred the world into streaks of white and red light. Cars ahead were abandoned. Empty. The floodwater had climbed nearly halfway up the doors now. Victoria reached for her phone again. No signal. Of course. She closed her eyes for one exhausted second before forcing herself to breathe. Billion-dollar negotiations never scared her. Television interviews never scared her. Standing alone in rooms full of powerful men never scared her. But this did. Because no spreadsheet in the world could protect her daughter from a storm. Another crack of thunder rolled through the sky. Sophie suddenly grabbed the sleeve of Victoria's coat with trembling fingers. Small fingers. Cold fingers. Victoria's heart tightened instantly. "It's okay, baby," she whispered softly. "Mom's here." But Sophie never answered. She just stared out the passenger window at the rising water outside, like she was waiting for something terrible to appear in it. Then came 3 slow knocks against the glass. Victoria froze. A large silhouette stood outside the SUV beneath the pouring rain. Tall, broad shoulders, yellow reflective stripes glowing through the darkness. A firefighter. Water streamed down the man's helmet as he leaned closer to the window, calm eyes scanning the frightened little girl inside the car. Victoria lowered the window barely 2 inches before cold rain sprayed across the leather seats. "Please tell me there is a way out of here," she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. The firefighter crouched slightly beside the door, flashlight beam cutting through the storm behind him. "Water is rising fast under this overpass," he said calmly. "I need both of you out of the vehicle now." His voice carried no panic, no urgency meant to frighten, just certainty, the kind that made people listen. Victoria glanced toward the floodwater pressing against the tires. It had climbed higher while she was not looking. Her stomach tightened. "My daughter does not do well with storms," she explained, almost apologetically. The man shifted his attention toward Sophie. He did not speak immediately, did not force a smile, did not treat her like she was fragile. He simply lowered himself enough so she could see his face beneath the rain dripping from his helmet. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently. "My name is Elijah. I am going to get you someplace warm tonight." Sophie stared at him without moving. Thunder rumbled overhead again, deep and heavy, shaking the steel beams above the interstate. Victoria felt Sophie tense instantly beside her. Elijah noticed too. "You hear that?" he asked softly. "Sounds big, but storms always sound worse under bridges." His tone remained low and even, like someone talking beside a campfire instead of standing knee-deep in floodwater. For the first time since the storm began, Sophie blinked away from the window and looked directly at him. Elijah gave one small nod as if that alone was enough progress for now. "Can you open the door for me?" he asked. Victoria reached for the handle quickly, but the pressure from the water resisted the movement. Elijah immediately stepped closer. "On 3, he said. 1, 2, 3. Together they forced the door open against the rushing water outside. Cold rain and wind exploded into the vehicle. Sophie flinched hard at the sound. Before panic could settle in, Elijah removed his heavy rescue jacket and carefully draped it around her shoulders like a blanket. The fabric smelled faintly of smoke, rain, and coffee. Warm somehow despite the storm. There you go, he murmured. You are doing better than most adults tonight. Victoria stepped carefully into the floodwater first, expensive heels sinking uselessly beneath the surface. Elijah steadied her arm without comment. No judgment in his eyes. No recognition either, even though half the city would have recognized Victoria Hale from magazine covers or television interviews. Right now, she was simply a frightened mother stranded in the rain. Then Elijah reached into the SUV towards Sophie. "Can I carry you?" he asked. Sophie hesitated only a second before slowly lifting her arms toward him. Something inside Victoria tightened unexpectedly at the sight. Elijah lifted the little girl with practiced ease, one arm secure beneath her while the other balanced against the current pushing through the street. Sophie buried her face against his shoulder immediately, tiny fingers gripping the reflective straps across his jacket. Elijah adjusted the hood gently over her headphones before stepping into the storm. Red emergency lights flickered through the rain ahead of them while water rushed around abandoned cars like dark moving glass. Victoria struggled to keep pace beside him, soaked within seconds, but Elijah never rushed her. Every few feet, he glanced back to make sure she was steady. "Almost there," he called over the storm. "Just keep following my voice." And somehow, through the thunder and sirens and rising water, his voice became the only thing that sounded safe. The emergency shelter had once been a middle school gymnasium, but tonight it looked more like the inside of a shaken snow globe. Wet coats hung across folding chairs. Flashlights flickered against basketball banners high on the walls. Children cried somewhere near the back while exhausted volunteers handed out bottled water and silver emergency blankets beneath harsh fluorescent lights. The storm rattled the windows every few minutes like it wanted inside too. Elijah pushed through the crowded entrance, carrying Sophie carefully against his shoulder, while Victoria followed close behind, soaked from head to toe and still trying to catch her breath. The moment they stepped into the warmth, Sophie tightened her grip around Elijah's neck instead of letting go. Elijah noticed immediately. "You are safe now," he told her gently. "No more water." Sophie said nothing. She only buried her face deeper against his jacket. Victoria brushed rainwater from her eyes and finally got a clear look at the man who had pulled them out of the flood. Up close, Elijah Brooks looked older than she first thought. Early 40s maybe. Strong shoulders beneath the heavy uniform. Calm dark eyes that seemed trained to search every room before resting anywhere too long. There was exhaustion in his face too. Not weakness. The kind that came from carrying responsibility for years without complaining about it. A volunteer approached with blankets. "We have some open cots near the west wall," she said quickly. "Power is unstable, but it is warmer there." Victoria nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Elijah lowered Sophie carefully onto one of the cots, but the little girl instantly reached for the sleeve of his jacket before he could step away. Tiny fingers. Silent panic. Elijah paused. "It is okay," he murmured softly. "I am not disappearing." Victoria stared at her daughter in disbelief. Sophie barely tolerated strangers touching her after the accident last year. Most therapists could not even get her to hold eye contact for more than a few seconds. Yet somehow this rain-soaked firefighter had carried her through a storm, and now she looked at him like he was the only solid thing left in the room. Elijah crouched beside the cot until Sophie slowly relaxed again beneath the blanket. "There you go," he whispered. "Nice and steady." Victoria folded her arms tightly, trying to hold herself together now that survival no longer demanded immediate focus. Her phone finally caught one weak signal bar and immediately exploded with notifications. Missed calls, emergency updates, news alerts about flooded highways across the city. She muted the screen without reading most of them. For once, the world could wait. Across the gym, another firefighter shouted for Elijah. "Brooks, we might get deployed west side in 20. Elijah raised a hand in acknowledgement before looking back toward Sophie. "I need to check in with my team for a minute," he explained gently. Sophie's fingers tightened around his sleeve again. Victoria saw hesitation flicker across Elijah's face. Not annoyance. Concern. Like he understood fear better than most people did. Then he reached into the side pocket of his gear and pulled out a small red flashlight, shaped like a cartoon fire truck. The plastic was scratched from use. "My son likes this thing because the battery barely ever dies," he said quietly, placing it into Sophie's hands. "You hold on to it for me until I come back, okay?" Sophie looked down at the flashlight for a long second before giving the smallest nod. Victoria had seen from her all night. Elijah smiled softly, not triumphant, just relieved. Then he stood and stepped away toward his crew, while Sophie watched him cross the crowded gym like children watch fathers leave for work before sunrise. And for reasons Victoria could not explain yet, that sight hurt something inside her chest. Nearly an hour passed before the storm eased enough for the gymnasium lights to stop flickering. The rain still hammered the roof overhead, but softer now, more distant, the kind of sound people could finally breathe through instead of fear. Sophie sat cross-legged beneath the emergency blanket with the small red flashlight glowing faintly in her hands. She had not let go of it once. Victoria sat beside her on the cot, arms folded tightly against the cold, watching volunteers move through the shelter with tired faces and paper coffee cups. Every few minutes, she caught herself looking toward the entrance doors, waiting. She did not understand why. Then the doors pushed open again with a gust of damp wind. Elijah stepped inside alongside two other firefighters, rainwater dripping from the edges of his jacket onto the polished gym floor. His helmet was tucked beneath one arm now, revealing close-cropped hair touched lightly with gray near the temples. Exhaustion sat heavier on his shoulders this time. Not dramatic, quiet, like something he had learned to carry a long time ago. Sophie noticed him immediately. Her posture changed before Victoria even turned her head. Elijah spotted the little red flashlight glowing from across the room and gave Sophie a small smile. "You kept it safe for me," he said as he approached. Sophie nodded once. Tiny, barely visible, but enough to make Elijah's smile soften further. Victoria found herself staring at that expression longer than she intended. It was strange seeing gentleness look so natural on someone built like him. "Road closures are getting worse downtown," Elijah explained while pulling off his soaked gloves. "Most people here will probably stay overnight." Victoria exhaled quietly. That figures. Her phone buzzed again with another flood warning. She ignored it. Elijah noticed the expensive device lighting up in her hand for the first time. The name Victoria Hale flashed briefly across the lock screen before disappearing. Recognition crossed his face slowly. Not excitement, just understanding. "Hale Dynamics," he said calmly. "That is your company." Victoria looked up, almost bracing herself for the usual shift people made once they recognized her. The curiosity, the careful politeness, the sudden calculation behind their eyes. But Elijah only nodded once and sat down on the edge of a nearby folding chair. "My son uses one of your learning tablets at school," he added simply. "He says the math games are too easy." Victoria blinked, caught off guard by the answer. Then, despite herself, she let out the smallest laugh of the night. "I will let the developers know they are failing third graders." Elijah smiled faintly at that. Sophie looked between them quietly, still holding the flashlight against her chest. Around them, the shelter settled into the tired silence that comes after fear finally burns itself out. Somewhere near the back wall, a baby cried softly before drifting quiet again. A volunteer rolled carts filled with blankets across the floor. Thunder echoed farther away now. Elijah leaned forward slightly, forearms resting on his knees. "Storms used to scare my son too," he said after a moment. "Still do sometimes." Victoria glanced toward him. "What helped?" Elijah looked down at the floor briefly before answering. "Consistency." His voice stayed calm, thoughtful. "Kids can handle fear better than adults think. What they cannot handle is feeling alone in it." The words landed gently, but Victoria felt them anyway. Deep, uncomfortable. True. She looked over at Sophie, who had quietly shifted closer toward Elijah's side of the cot without even realizing it herself. And for the first time in years, Victoria wondered if success had slowly taught her how to provide everything for her daughter except peace. Around midnight, the shelter grew quieter. Exhaustion settled over the gymnasium in slow waves. Children slept beneath silver blankets while volunteers lowered their voices to tired whispers near folding tables stacked with supplies. The storm still moved beyond the walls, but farther away now, like an argument losing strength in another room. Sophie had finally fallen asleep, curled sideways on the cot, the red flashlight still resting loosely in her hands beneath the blanket. Victoria brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's face carefully, studying the softness that only appeared when Sophie slept. During the day, there were therapists, structured routines, gentle questions that usually ended in silence. But tonight, after only a few hours beside Elijah Brooks, Her daughter looked calmer than she had in months. Victoria leaned back slowly against the cold gym wall and closed her eyes for 1 second too long. You should eat something. Elijah's voice pulled her awake gently. He stood nearby holding 2 paper trays from the volunteer station. 1 cup of black coffee. 1 small bowl of soup. Steam curled upward between them. Victoria blinked in surprise. You did not have to do that. Elijah shrugged lightly as he handed her the coffee. You look like somebody who forgot dinner existed. The corner of her mouth almost lifted again. Almost. That obvious? Only to another tired parent. He settled into the folding chair across from her, stretching one leg carefully like his knee bothered him after hours in wet gear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The gym hummed softly around them with distant coughing, squeaking sneakers, and the low rumble of generators outside. Victoria wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup. How old is your son? She asked quietly. Elijah's expression softened instantly. 8. His name is Noah. Does he know you are out here tonight? Elijah nodded once. My neighbor is staying with him until my shift ends. He paused briefly before adding. He hates storms too, but he pretends he does not because he thinks it helps me worry less. Victoria looked down into the dark coffee. Sophie used to love thunderstorms. Her voice grew quieter. Last year we were driving home when a delivery truck lost control during heavy rain. Elijah listened without interrupting. Nobody was seriously hurt, she continued carefully. But after that night, she stopped talking much, especially during storms. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while the silence stretched gently between them. Not awkward, just human. Elijah rested his forearms on his knees. Kids remember fear differently, he said softly. Adults try to move past it. Children stay inside it longer. Victoria swallowed hard against something rising unexpectedly in her chest. I spent thousands on specialists, she admitted. Behavioral therapy, child psychologists, neurologists. Every expert told me healing takes time. Elijah nodded slowly. Sometimes it does. And sometimes, he glanced toward the sleeping little girl on the cot. Sometimes children just need to feel safe before they can find their voice again. Victoria stared at him quietly after that. No performance in his words. No attempt to sound wise. He spoke the way firefighters probably spoke during rescues. Calm enough for people to borrow strength from it. Across the gym, a television mounted high on the wall flashed weather updates beside emergency maps of the city. More flooding downtown. More road closures. Victoria looked toward the screen before letting out a tired breath. Half my executive team is probably losing their minds right now. Elijah sipped his coffee. And yet the world somehow survived you disappearing for a few hours. She looked at him sharply before realizing he was teasing her. Just slightly. It caught her off guard enough that a quiet laugh escaped before she could stop it. Real this time. Small. Tired. Human. Elijah smiled faintly into his coffee cup, and for the first time all night, Victoria did not feel like the most alone person in the room. By 2 in the morning, most of the shelter had surrendered to exhaustion. The gym lights were dimmed halfway, casting long shadows across rows of folding cots and sleeping families wrapped in silver blankets that crinkled softly whenever someone turned over. Rain tapped steadily against the high windows now instead of crashing against them. Softer. Tired. Like the storm itself had finally run out of anger. Victoria sat awake near Sophie's cot with her shoes abandoned beneath the chair beside her. Her expensive black slacks were still damp near the cuffs from the floodwater earlier, and her hair had long since fallen loose from the neat style she usually wore in boardrooms and interviews. For once, she did not bother fixing it. Across the gym, Elijah leaned against the wall near a supply table, speaking quietly into his phone. Victoria was not trying to listen, but the shelter had become so still that voices traveled farther than usual. Hey, buddy, Elijah said softly. You still awake? A small voice crackled faintly through the speaker. Victoria could not hear the words clearly, only the sleepy rhythm of a child trying hard to stay awake for his father. Elijah smiled tiredly at something his son said. The expression changed his whole face. Softer around the eyes. Lighter somehow. No, I did not wrestle an alligator tonight, he replied quietly. Just a lot of rain. Victoria looked down before he could notice her watching. She suddenly felt like she had stepped accidentally into something private. Elijah listened for another moment before speaking again. Did Mrs. Ramirez make you eat vegetables? A pause. Then a low laugh escaped him. That bad, huh? Sophie stirred quietly beneath her blanket nearby, but did not wake. Victoria glanced toward her daughter and then back toward Elijah without meaning to. There was something strange about watching a man built for emergencies speak so gently to a child at 2 in the morning. Most men Victoria knew lived inside their work like prisoners, their voices sharpened by pressure, their attention always divided somewhere else. But Elijah sounded fully present even through a cracked phone speaker in the middle of a disaster shelter. "I will be home in the morning," he promised softly. "Get some sleep for me, Noah." Another pause. His expression shifted then. Smaller, more fragile somehow. "Love you too, son." He ended the call slowly and stood there for a second with the phone resting loosely in his hand before slipping it back into his jacket pocket. Victoria looked away immediately, pretending to focus on the cold coffee sitting beside her chair. Elijah walked back over a moment later carrying another blanket from the supply table. Without a word, he draped it carefully across Sophie's legs where the first one had slipped loose. The movement was so automatic it almost hurt to watch. "You should try sleeping too," he told Victoria quietly. "You have been awake for almost 20 hours. She rubbed tired fingers against her temple. "I am not very good at shutting my brain off." Elijah nodded like he understood more than she expected. "Neither am I." He sat down in the folding chair across from her again, slower this time, one hand briefly pressing against his lower ribs, as if something there still ached. Victoria noticed the movement instantly. "Are you hurt?" Elijah shook his head once. "Old injury. Nothing dramatic." But the answer came too quickly. Victoria studied him quietly beneath the dim shelter lights. The dark circles beneath his eyes. The stiffness in the way he moved after hours on his feet. The exhaustion he kept hiding beneath calmness for everyone else's sake. "You keep taking care of people like you forgot you were one of them too," she said before she could stop herself. Elijah looked at her for a moment after that. Really looked. Then the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Comes with the job, I guess." Victoria lowered her gaze toward the sleeping little girl beside her. "No," she said softly. "I think it comes from who you are." The words settled quietly between them while the storm faded farther into the night. The shelter lights dimmed even further sometime after 3 in the morning, leaving most of the gym wrapped in a tired amber glow from emergency lanterns set along the walls. Outside, rainwater still rolled down the windows in silver lines, but the thunder had almost disappeared completely now. Chicago sounded quieter than Victoria had ever heard it. No traffic, no helicopters overhead. No endless vibration from a city addicted to movement. Just breathing, sleeping, waiting for morning. Sophie shifted softly beneath her blankets and finally sat up, rubbing tired eyes beneath messy blonde curls. The little red flashlight still rested in her lap. Elijah looked over immediately from the folding chair nearby. "Hey there," he said gently. "You made it through the worst part." Sophie blinked at him sleepily, but did not retreat the way she usually did around unfamiliar adults. Victoria watched the interaction quietly from beside the cot, almost afraid to interrupt whatever invisible thread had formed between them. Elijah reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a wrapped granola bar. "Emergency shelter cuisine," he said solemnly. "5-star dining." Sophie stared at the snack for a second before something unexpected happened. The smallest smile touched the corner of her mouth. Tiny, quick, but real. Victoria felt her chest tighten instantly at the sight. She could not remember the last time she had seen Sophie smile during a storm. Elijah handed the granola bar over carefully like it was some kind of important agreement between them. "My son likes the chocolate chip ones best," he said. "Claims the oatmeal raisin bars are a crime against humanity." Sophie looked down at the wrapper in her hands. Then, so quietly Victoria almost thought she imagined it, the little girl whispered, "I agree." Elijah froze for half a second. Victoria did too. The world seemed to stop moving around them. Sophie lowered her eyes quickly afterward, like she had not meant for the words to escape at all. But they had. Victoria stared at her daughter in complete disbelief. "Sophie," she breathed softly. Sophie pulled the blanket closer around herself, suddenly shy beneath the attention. Elijah, however, did not react dramatically, did not celebrate, did not make the moment feel fragile. He simply nodded once like her voice had always belonged there. "Smart kid," he said calmly. "Never trust raisins pretending to be candy." A soft laugh escaped Sophie then, small and scratchy from disuse, but unmistakably a laugh. Victoria pressed trembling fingers briefly against her lips before turning away toward the dark windows, pretending to fix her hair while emotion rushed unexpectedly into her throat. Elijah noticed anyway. He noticed everything. But he gave her dignity by looking down at the coffee cup in his hands instead. Across the shelter, a volunteer pushed a cart of fresh blankets past sleeping families while someone quietly tuned a radio near the entrance. The ordinary sounds of exhausted people surviving together filled the silence gently. Sophie unwrapped the granola bar slowly before glancing toward Elijah again. "Does your son hate broccoli too?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Elijah leaned back in the folding chair with a tired smile. "Violently." Sophie nodded seriously, like this information mattered deeply. "I do too. Then the two of you would get along just fine." Victoria sat completely still beside them, watching her daughter speak in broken little pieces after months of silence, and suddenly none of the meetings waiting for her tomorrow seemed remotely important anymore. Billion-dollar contracts, investors, press conferences. None of them had managed to give her child this moment. But somehow a tired firefighter sitting beneath flickering gym lights with rain still dripping from his boots had done it without even trying. Sophie looked down at the flashlight in her lap before holding it carefully toward Elijah. "You can have it back now," she whispered. Elijah shook his head gently. "Nah," he said softly. "I think you should keep it for a while." Sophie hugged the little red flashlight against her chest like something precious. And for the first time in a very long time, the fear inside her eyes looked smaller. Morning arrived slowly through the high gymnasium windows, pale gray sunlight replacing the cold blue glow of emergency lanterns 1 inch at a time. The storm had finally moved east sometime before dawn, leaving behind silence, flooded streets, and the exhausted stillness that follows long nights people will remember for years. Volunteers moved carefully through the shelter, handing out styrofoam cups of coffee and small breakfast trays, while children rubbed sleepy eyes beneath wrinkled blankets. Sophie sat beside Victoria eating dry cereal from a paper bowl, with the little red flashlight still resting beside her like a treasured object. She had spoken only a few more words since the night before, but even that felt miraculous now. Victoria watched her daughter closely, afraid the silence might return if she breathed too hard around it. Across the gym, Elijah stood near the entrance speaking with another firefighter while pulling on a fresh department jacket someone must have delivered overnight. The back of it read Engine 42 beneath reflective silver lettering. His posture remained calm despite the fatigue visible in every movement now. Victoria noticed the slight stiffness in his side again when he reached for his coffee. "You should probably tell him to go home and sleep," said a voice beside her. Victoria turned to find an older firefighter setting down supply boxes near the wall. Gray beard, heavy boots, kind eyes worn soft by decades of difficult nights. He followed her gaze toward Elijah and smiled faintly. "Brooks forgets he is human sometimes." Victoria glanced back toward Elijah. "Does he always work storms like this?" The older man let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Brooks works everything." He lowered his voice slightly. "House fires, floods, car wrecks. Last winter, he pulled 3 people out of an apartment building after a gas explosion downtown." Victoria looked toward Elijah again, surprised. "I do not remember hearing about that." "That is because he never sticks around for cameras." The firefighter shook his head with something close to admiration. Department tried giving him a medal for it. He skipped the ceremony and picked his son up from school instead. Victoria felt something shift quietly inside her chest at those words. Not admiration exactly. Something deeper, more unsettling. The older firefighter continued unpacking supplies. "Man has been through hell and still shows up kinder than most people I know." Victoria hesitated before asking, "What do you mean?" The firefighter glanced briefly toward Elijah across the room. "Lost his wife 4 years ago. Kitchen fire while he was on duty across town." The words landed softly but heavily. Victoria looked down instinctively toward her coffee cup. Suddenly the tiredness in Elijah's eyes made sense. The gentleness, too. The way he noticed fear before anyone spoke it out loud. "He raised Noah alone after that," the man added quietly. "Never once heard him complain." Across the shelter, Elijah laughed softly at something another firefighter said before rubbing a tired hand over the back of his neck. Just an ordinary moment. But Victoria could not stop seeing it now through the weight of everything he carried privately. Sophie looked up from her cereal then. "Mom." Victoria blinked back quickly. Yes, sweetheart. Sophie pointed quietly toward Elijah. He looks sad when he thinks nobody sees him. Victoria turned toward her daughter in surprise. Children notice what adults miss, Elijah had said earlier. She understood now. Across the room, Elijah thanked a volunteer for fresh coffee before finally glancing back toward them. His eyes met Victoria's for one brief second. Calm, tired, kind. No performance in any of it. And suddenly Victoria realized something uncomfortable. All her life, she had trusted people who knew how to impress rooms. Men who spoke loudly, moved confidently, controlled conversations. But the man standing near the shelter doors with rain-scuffed boots and exhaustion hidden behind quiet eyes felt more dependable than anyone she had known in years. Sophie slid carefully off the cot, then walked several small steps toward Elijah before stopping shyly halfway across the floor. Elijah immediately lowered himself slightly so he would not seem so tall. Sophie held out the red flashlight with both hands. You should keep it today, she whispered softly. Elijah looked at the flashlight for a moment before smiling gently at her. How about this, he said. You hold on to it until the next storm passes too. And for the first time since the accident last year, Sophie nodded without fear. By late morning, the shelter had begun slowly emptying as floodwaters receded across parts of the city. Families gathered damp backpacks and sleeping children, while volunteers taped updated road maps near the entrance doors. The gymnasium no longer felt like a place built for emergency. It felt like the strange quiet after one. Temporary, fragile, human. Victoria stood near the west windows speaking with one of her assistants through a finally stable phone connection, while Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor nearby with a pack of crayons and printer paper a volunteer had handed out to the children. No media statements until we confirm the downtown server damage, Victoria said calmly into the phone. And cancel the investor lunch. I do not care who complains about it. Her voice had returned to its usual composed rhythm, but something softer lingered beneath it now. Something even she noticed. Across the room, Elijah finished helping an elderly couple arrange transportation before finally removing his heavy department jacket for the first time all morning. Beneath it, he wore a dark navy t-shirt with faint ash marks near one shoulder and the Chicago Fire Department emblem stretched across the chest. He rolled the stiffness from one shoulder slowly, exhaustion pulling at every movement now that the crisis had passed. Victoria watched him for a second longer than necessary before forcing her attention back to the call. No, she said quietly into the phone. I am not returning to the office today. Even she sounded surprised by that answer. Sophie remained focused on the paper in front of her, tongue pressed slightly against her lip in concentration while she colored carefully with a blue crayon. Every few minutes, she glanced toward Elijah without realizing she was doing it. Elijah noticed anyway. He always noticed. One of the volunteers passed by carrying coffee trays and paused beside him. You heading home after this, Brooks? Elijah accepted a cup with tired gratitude. Eventually. Your captain said you already worked 30 hours this week before the storm even hit. Elijah gave a small shrug. Storm did not ask for my schedule. The volunteer laughed softly before moving on. Victoria ended her call moments later and slipped her phone back into her coat pocket. For the first time in years, the constant pressure of her company felt oddly distant inside her mind, like noise she no longer wanted surrounding her every second. Sophie suddenly stood up from the floor, clutching her paper tightly in both hands. Her small sneakers squeaked softly against the gym floor as she walked toward Elijah, with visible determination battling shyness every step of the way. Elijah immediately lowered his coffee cup and crouched slightly to meet her at eye level again. What do you got there? He asked gently. Sophie held out the paper without speaking. Elijah took it carefully by the corners and looked down. The drawing was simple, childlike. 3 figures standing beneath a giant red umbrella while rain fell around them in blue crayon lines. One tall figure wore a firefighter helmet. One had long blonde hair. The smallest stood in the middle holding a little red flashlight. Elijah stared quietly at the drawing for a moment longer than expected. Victoria felt her throat tighten immediately from across the room. Sophie shifted nervously beneath the silence. I know your boots are bigger, she whispered softly. Elijah looked up at her then, and Victoria saw something move behind his tired eyes so quickly it almost disappeared before she could name it. Grief maybe, or tenderness, or simply the shock of being included in something gentle after surviving too much loss. He cleared his throat once before smiling carefully. I think you got the boots exactly right. Sophie smiled shyly at that. Elijah folded the drawing with extraordinary care before sliding it into the inside pocket of his jacket like something important. Not temporary. Important. Victoria walked toward them slowly, emotion pressing unexpectedly against her chest again. She has not drawn people in months, she admitted quietly. Elijah looked toward Sophie first before answering. Maybe she finally feels safe enough to. The gym doors opened briefly then, letting cold sunlight spill across the polished floor. Somewhere outside, the city was beginning to move again. Cars, sirens, construction, noise. But inside that shelter, beside a tired firefighter carrying a child's drawing in his jacket pocket, Victoria suddenly realized healing never arrived loudly. Sometimes it entered a room soaked in rainwater and carrying coffee stains instead. The shelter continued thinning out through the afternoon until entire rows of cots stood empty beneath the tall gym windows. Sunlight finally pushed through the clouds outside, pale and cold against streets still flooded in places across the city. Volunteers stacked chairs. Emergency crews checked names against transportation lists. The world was rebuilding itself one exhausted hour at a time. Victoria stood near the entrance speaking briefly with her driver, who had finally managed to reach the shelter after navigating closed roads for nearly 2 hours. The car is waiting outside whenever you are ready, Miss Hale, he said carefully. Victoria glanced over her shoulder towards Sophie, sitting beside Elijah near the supply tables. The little girl was listening intently while Elijah folded paper into what looked like a crooked fire truck. Sophie had not looked that relaxed around another adult since before the accident. Give us a little more time, Victoria said quietly. The driver nodded and stepped back outside. Elijah handed the paper fire truck towards Sophie with complete seriousness. Official engine 42 backup vehicle, he explained. Top speed of at least 4 miles per hour downhill. Sophie giggled softly before carefully taking the folded paper into her hands. Victoria stopped walking for a second at the sound. That laugh again. Every time it happened, it felt like hearing music return to a house that had been empty too long. Elijah looked up as Victoria approached. I think she is improving our department budget, he said lightly, gesturing toward the paper truck. Sophie nodded solemnly. It needs glitter. Every emergency vehicle improves with glitter, Elijah agreed. Victoria smiled despite herself before her expression slowly softened into something quieter, more vulnerable. Sophie, she said gently, would you mind helping that volunteer pick out another blanket for the little boy over there? Sophie glanced between them, suddenly perceptive in the way children often are, but after a second she slid off the chair and walked toward the volunteer station carrying her paper fire truck carefully against her chest. The moment she disappeared into the crowd, silence settled between Victoria and Elijah. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Elijah leaned back slightly against the table behind him, exhaustion visible in the slow rise and fall of his breathing now that adrenaline no longer carried him forward. Victoria looked down briefly at her hands before speaking. I owe you more than a thank you. Elijah shook his head immediately. You do not owe me anything. That is not true. Her voice came softer this time, less polished. You helped my daughter more in one night than specialists have managed in almost a year. Elijah looked down for a moment before answering carefully. I think Sophie did the hard part herself. Victoria gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. You really do not know what you did, do you? Elijah did not answer right away. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected off standing floodwater in bright silver flashes. Finally, he spoke quietly. People gave me space to fall apart after my wife died. Victoria looked up slowly. Elijah kept his eyes on the floor as he continued. Most of them did not know they were helping. They just stayed, checked on Noah, brought food, sat in silence when I could not hold conversations anymore. His voice remained calm, but grief still lived quietly beneath every word. Sometimes healing starts when somebody stops trying to fix you and just makes you feel less alone. Victoria swallowed hard against the sudden pressure in her chest. I do not know how to do that, she admitted before she could stop herself. The honesty surprised even her. Elijah looked at her then. Fully. Sure you do. She shook her head slowly. No. I know how to manage companies. Solve problems. Keep people depending on me. Her voice grew smaller. But somewhere along the way, I think my daughter stopped needing a provider and started needing her mother back. The gymnasium noises faded strangely around them after that confession. Elijah said nothing for several seconds. Then, very gently, he spoke. The fact that you are afraid of failing her probably means you love her more than you realize. Victoria looked away immediately, blinking hard against sudden emotion rising too quickly to hide. She had not cried in front of anyone in years. Not board members. Not reporters. Not even after the divorce papers arrived 6 months after Sophie's accident. But standing in a half-empty shelter beside a tired firefighter carrying her daughter's drawing inside his jacket pocket, she suddenly felt dangerously close. The loudspeaker near the shelter entrance crackled suddenly, just as Victoria lowered her eyes to steady herself again. Engine 42 report to West Command immediately. Repeat, Engine 42 to West Command. The entire atmosphere inside the gym shifted in an instant. Conversations paused. Volunteers looked toward the doors. Somewhere outside, distant sirens cut sharply through the quiet afternoon air. Elijah straightened automatically before the announcement even finished. Training. Instinct. Duty pulling him upright faster than exhaustion ever could. Victoria felt her stomach tighten unexpectedly at the sight. Elijah grabbed his department jacket from the chair beside him and slid it back on in one practiced motion. The paper drawing Sophie had made remained tucked safely inside the inner pocket. What happened? Victoria asked quietly. Elijah checked a message flashing across the small radio clipped near his shoulder. His expression changed slightly. Focus sharpening. Warehouse fire near the riverfront, he answered calmly. Storm probably damaged the electrical system. He spoke the words steadily, but Victoria suddenly hated how ordinary danger sounded in his voice. Sophie walked back toward them carrying a folded blanket almost too big for her small arms. The moment she noticed Elijah pulling on his jacket, her smile faded. You are leaving? She asked softly. Elijah crouched down immediately, so they were eye level again. I have to help my crew for a little while. Sophie looked down at the blanket in her hands. Because somebody is scared? Elijah's expression softened visibly. Yeah, he said quietly. Probably. The little girl nodded slowly like she understood that answer more than most adults would. Victoria watched them silently while something restless tightened inside her chest. It surprised her how quickly she had grown used to Elijah's calm presence nearby. The shelter already felt colder at the thought of him walking back into danger again. Elijah stood and adjusted the radio on his shoulder. Your driver still outside? He asked Victoria. She nodded once. Good. Roads should clear more by tonight. He hesitated briefly before adding, you and Sophie should get home. Home. The word felt strange suddenly. Their penthouse downtown with its silent hallways and untouched guest rooms no longer sounded comforting the way it used to. Sophie stepped closer before Elijah could turn away. Will you come back after? She asked quietly. Elijah looked at her for one long second. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black marker. He carefully drew a tiny firefighter badge on the side of her red flashlight. That means you are officially part of Engine 42 now, he told her softly. Sophie stared down at the badge like he had handed her something priceless. And Engine 42 always comes back, Elijah added gently. Victoria looked away for a second at those words because the emotion rising behind her ribs suddenly felt too visible. Another call blasted through the radio near the entrance. More urgent this time. Elijah nodded toward them both. Take care of each other. Then he turned and headed toward the shelter doors alongside the other firefighters gathering near the exit. Heavy boots against polished gym floors. Radios crackling. Yellow reflective stripes catching flashes of afternoon sunlight. Sophie ran forward suddenly before he reached the doors. Elijah. He turned immediately. Sophie hesitated only half a second before throwing her arms around him tightly. The gym seemed to fall completely silent around Victoria at the sight. Elijah froze briefly in surprise before carefully hugging the little girl back with one arm, gentle like he understood fragile things too well to hold them carelessly. Be safe, Sophie whispered against his jacket. Elijah closed his eyes for the shortest moment before stepping back. I will do my best. Then he gave Victoria one final look across the shelter. Calm, quiet, tired. Something unspoken passing between them too large for either of them to name yet. And then he was gone through the double doors into cold sunlight, sirens, and smoke rising somewhere beyond the city skyline. Victoria stood motionless long after the doors closed behind him, because for the first time in years, she realized fear was not just losing someone you loved. Sometimes fear was realizing how deeply someone mattered before you were ready to admit it. The drive downtown felt strangely hollow after Elijah left. Chicago moved around them slowly beneath a washed-out gray sky, streets still slick with storm water and lined with emergency crews clearing fallen branches and stalled cars. Sophie sat quietly in the back seat of the black SUV holding the red flashlight in both hands while Victoria stared out the window beside her own reflection. Every few blocks, they passed flashing lights or fire trucks parked near damaged buildings, and each time Victoria felt her stomach tighten without warning. She kept telling herself it was irrational. Elijah Brooks was a firefighter. This was his job. But logic did not seem to matter anymore. Back at the penthouse, the silence felt different than it used to. Larger somehow. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the riverfront district where thin gray smoke still drifted upward in the distance. Sophie wandered quietly into the living room, still carrying the flashlight, while Victoria stood near the windows with her phone pressed tightly against her ear. No interviews, she repeated sharply to someone from her public relations team. And absolutely do not send flowers or press photographers to the warehouse site. She ended the call before they could argue further. The city already knew Victoria Hale's name, but Elijah did not seem like a man who wanted gratitude performed publicly. Sophie climbed carefully onto the couch nearby and looked toward the skyline. "Do you think he is cold?" she asked softly. Victoria looked over at her daughter. "Who?" Sophie gave her a tiny look that said the answer should have been obvious. "Elijah." Victoria glanced back toward the distant smoke beyond the river. "Probably," she admitted quietly. Sophie pulled the emergency blanket from the shelter tighter around herself. "I hope somebody gave him coffee." The comment was so sincere that Victoria felt something ache unexpectedly behind her ribs again. Hours passed slowly after that. Afternoon became evening beneath low clouds and pale winter light. Victoria tried opening her laptop twice before closing it again without reading a single email. Numbers and contracts suddenly felt absurd compared to the image of firefighters standing somewhere inside smoke and freezing wind while the rest of the city returned to ordinary life. Sophie eventually fell asleep, curled sideways on the couch beneath the emergency blanket, one small hand still wrapped around the flashlight with the drawn firefighter badge. Victoria covered her gently before moving back toward the windows. Outside, sunset stained the river dark gold beneath the smoke. Her phone buzzed suddenly. An unknown number. Victoria answered immediately. "Miss Hale," a male voice said. "This is Deputy Chief Morrison from Chicago Fire Department." Victoria straightened instinctively. "Is everything all right?" There was a brief pause. "I just wanted to let you know the warehouse situation is under control." Victoria closed her eyes briefly in relief before she could stop herself. The deputy chief continued gently. "Brooks mentioned your daughter was frightened during the storm. He asked if someone could let her know Engine 42 kept its promise." Victoria swallowed hard against sudden emotion. Even now, after hours battling another emergency, Elijah had remembered Sophie. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Is he all right?" Another small pause. "He is exhausted," the chief admitted with a tired chuckle. "But that man could work through the apocalypse if somebody handed him enough black coffee." Victoria smiled faintly despite the tightness in her chest. "That sounds accurate." After the call ended, she stood alone beside the windows for a long time, watching emergency lights flicker faintly near the riverfront miles away. Then, without fully understanding why, she walked into her office and opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside sat stacks of unopened invitations, investor gifts, and polished silver awards collected over years of building an empire. Victoria looked at them quietly before closing the drawer again untouched. None of it felt important tonight. Across the room, Sophie stirred slightly in her sleep and whispered one soft word against the couch pillow. "Safe." Victoria turned toward her daughter slowly. The city lights reflected across the windows behind them while the storm clouds finally drifted farther east beyond Chicago. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria realized peace was not something people purchased with success. Sometimes peace arrived wearing heavy boots and carrying exhausted kindness into rooms that had forgotten how to breathe. 3 days later, The city had almost returned to normal. Traffic filled the streets again. News stations moved on to other headlines. Floodwater disappeared beneath sunlight and construction noise as if the storm had never happened at all. But something stayed. Sophie stood near the large windows inside Hale Dynamics headquarters, holding the red flashlight carefully against her chest, while Victoria finished a meeting she barely listened to anymore. Across the conference room, executives discussed recovery numbers and insurance projections in polished corporate voices. Victoria looked at them for a moment before quietly closing her tablet. "Reschedule the rest," she said calmly. "For tomorrow." Confused glances moved around the room, but nobody argued. Sophie waited patiently beside the elevator afterward, wearing a yellow raincoat, even though the skies were clear. "Are we late?" she asked softly as Victoria approached. Victoria smiled faintly. "No, sweetheart. I think we are right on time." 20 minutes later, their black SUV pulled up outside Fire Station 42 on the west side of Chicago. The building looked ordinary. Red brick, white garage doors, a coffee machine visible through the front windows. Nothing about it suggested heroics lived there. Sophie climbed out first, gripping the flashlight tightly, while Victoria followed more slowly. Through the open garage bay, Elijah sat alone near the back of the station, finishing paperwork at a metal table with a black coffee beside one elbow. He looked up at the sound of footsteps. Surprise crossed his face first, then something gentler. Sophie ran forward before shyness could stop her this time. Elijah stood just in time to catch her small hug around his waist. "Engine 42 came back," she announced proudly against his jacket. Elijah smiled down at her with tired warmth in his eyes. "Told you we would." Victoria stopped a few feet away, watching them together while afternoon sunlight spilled across the concrete floor between fire trucks and hanging hoses. Elijah looked older in daylight somehow, more exhausted, but peaceful too. Sophie finally stepped back and held up the red flashlight. "I still have it." Elijah nodded solemnly. "Then I guess you are still part of the crew." Sophie grinned before wandering off toward one of the parked engines with another firefighter offering to show her the truck ladder. Silence settled gently between Victoria and Elijah after she left. Not awkward. Familiar now. Victoria looked at the coffee beside his paperwork. "Black. No sugar," she said softly. Elijah glanced down at the cup with a faint smile. Some habits survive storms. Victoria looked at him quietly for a long moment before speaking again. "You changed something in her." Elijah shook his head lightly. No, his eyes moved towards Sophie, laughing softly near the fire truck. "I think she just remembered she was safe." Victoria felt emotion rise unexpectedly again, but this time she did not fight it. She simply stood there in the quiet fire station, watching the man who carried kindness so naturally he probably never realized how rare it was. Outside, the city moved loudly beyond the station walls. Sirens, traffic, voices. But inside that sunlit garage, beside a tired firefighter with coffee-stained paperwork and gentle eyes, Victoria finally understood something simple and life-changing. He did not rescue her daughter by being fearless. He rescued her by making fear feel smaller.